Well, good morning. It's really good to be here this morning. And it's such a privilege to be able to talk to you this morning. I think my dad called me in October, and he mentioned this to me, and I thought, man, that'd be really fun to do. And I would love to do that. And so here we are, and I'm very happy to be speaking to you. So it's strange to be back home because Calgary is kind of our home, but when we come back here, this feels like home too, and so it's like we have two homes. And that's a very cool thing to have. And so for those who don't know me, I'm Gary Jennings Jr., as people call me in Brandon. I got to lose that name in Calgary, thankfully. But here I'm known as Junior, and I'm a web developer. I develop things for the web. And I started this journey in the fall. And previously, I was on staff here at Calvary Temple as assistant pastor. And so lots of things have changed for me and Kelsey this fall. And it's been just a really cool and interesting season for us. We didn't really know what to expect when we were going in this direction. And lots of cool things have been happening. And we're very happy with the direction that we're going in. And so Kelsey is currently a grade 3 teacher at Glenmore Christian Academy in Calgary, and actually when she went in for an interview, one of the people that were interviewing her used to be her teacher. So this is the school that she grew up in, and so things have a way of coming full circle, and she's just loving her time there. And for me, I've finished my schooling, and now I'm sort of out in the wild, starting in January, and so it looks like it's going to be a pretty busy season for me as well, and so which is great. It's perfect. And so work has been something that I've been thinking about quite a lot, and of course faith is something I think about quite a lot. And and so this morning I want to talk about work and faith, and how do these two things go together, and how do we put these things together? Are they two different things? Are they the same thing? What do we do with this? And so when I was an assistant pastor here, I remember I would get into conversations with people about work and about finding meaning and value in the work they do, maybe spiritual meaning and value. And they'd often say to me, "Oh, well, it must be so easy for you because you're a pastor, right? That's an easy connection to make. But what about me? How do I find value in the work that I do?" And so now that I'm, a web developer, I'm asking the same question: how do I do this? How do I marry the two together, my spiritual life and my work life? And when we talk about work, it's not simply just your 9 to 5. It could be, what you do in your free time. I know you guys just finished something called the Singing Christmas Tree. I don't know too much about it, but I hear that's a little bit of work. It's a lot of work, actually. I remember working, with the sound and everything, and that's a lot of work. And so that could fit in this category as well. Raising your kids, if anything qualifies as work, it would be that. I don't actually know, but I've observed most of my friends now have kids, and I'm observing them work very, very hard raising their kids. And so work can be a lot of different things. And so this morning we just want to go in this direction of how do we talk about our work, and how do we talk about our spiritual life? Are these separate things? Are they the same thing? How do we do this? And so before we get started, let's just pray. God, I pray that this morning as we talk about our work that we do, I pray that you would speak to us. You speak to each one of us, because each one of us do something different. Each one of us are called to something different. So God, I pray that you would speak to us this morning, and the word that we read, the words that we read from your word, I pray that they would speak to us, and that we would leave this place with a new perspective on things. In your name, amen. So we just finished the Christmas season, and I can't believe it's gone already. Like, I love Christmas. It's one of the only seasons where, the whole season just sort of drapes the city. You know when it's Christmas. You look out, and you see the lights. You see all this sort of stuff. And in Christmas, sort of, you can see it all around you, and I love it so much. And during the Christmas season, we talk about a few different biblical stories. One of them is the three wise men. And might be my favorite story in the Bible. I think it's such a cool and interesting story. God chooses to speak to these people through what they're interested in, studying the stars. And I think that's such a profound thought that whatever we are interested in, God can speak that language. So whatever that you are interested in, God can speak that. God can work through that. And I just think the wise men is such a cool and profound story, and we could spend a whole morning talking about how God speaks our language. But I want to look at the story from a little bit of a different angle, from the idea of was their work, what they did. And for those who are unfamiliar with the story, who are these guys and what's the story behind them? There's a lot of mystery surrounding them. We know they're magi from the east, and so a lot of people want to say, well, these guys were priests from Babylon, maybe they were scholars from Babylon, maybe they were just employed to know a little bit about everything. They were very intelligent people, and there's a few other theories out there, but we don't know too much about these guys. But we do know they were intelligent and curious people who studied the sky and studied the stars. And as the story goes, it's a very simple story. They notice something different in the stars, and so they decide, okay, we're going to follow this one star to the baby Jesus. And then they came prepared. They came to worship him and give him gifts. And very, very simple story. They run into Herod along the way, but very simple story. But what strikes me about this story is that they are reaching for God. They're reaching, literally reaching for the stars in this case. And they're following the star, and they're reaching for something. And you ever notice that people are kind of at their best when they're reaching for something outside of themselves, when they get past themselves, and they're reaching for something that's bigger than themselves. I think people are sort of at their best when they do that in any sort of field. You can look at sports, the best. I watch the playoffs quite a bit. I'm kind of a playoff fan, so I don't watch throughout the season. I just watch the playoffs, so some people don't call me a true hockey fan for that. But playoffs are so interesting because the most unlikely people come out and just shine in the playoffs, right? The most unlikely people will make a huge play. And is it because they're talented? I don't know. Maybe it's because they're reaching for something very, their heart is in it, And I think people are at their best when they're reaching. And there is this story by Frederick Buechner. I think I've talked about this guy most times I've spoken up here. You've probably heard this guy before, heard me talk about him. He wrote a novel called Alphabet of Grace. And it's a really cool book. It's about him throughout his day. It's a very short book. It's just him throughout his day and all the thoughts that go through his head. And it's mostly about how he hears from God throughout the day. And so it's this alphabet of grace. It's the alphabet that God uses to speak to him. And it's really cool because he's very blunt in the book. He's very honest. And there's this one passage where he wakes up in the morning and he gets up in front of the mirror and sees his face. And then he just starts criticizing it. And he talks about, it's the same every day. It doesn't quite look the way I want it to. The smile's not quite right. The eyes don't do what I want them to do. I've experienced pain and sorrow with this face. I've cried with this face. And he can just see all of this as he's looking in the mirror. And he's just criticizing it first thing in the morning. But then he goes downstairs and he eats breakfast with his family and he talks with his family. And maybe someone makes a joke and he laughs. And he says, there's a change that happens when I eat breakfast with my family. I'm no longer thinking about myself. I'm no longer criticizing my face. I become my face, is what he says. It's such a cool way of putting it. And in that moment, I'm no longer inward. I'm no longer just criticizing myself, thinking about myself. I'm involved in something outside of myself. I'm taking part in something that's bigger than me. And he talks about how this is kind of like a healthy thing to do. When we get outside of our own selves and we reach for something outside of ourselves, something profound happens. And I think this is sort of a good way to think about religion as well. I think religion is at its best when the person is reaching for God, when the person is sort of forgets about themselves for a second and is sort of taken up by God and taken up in the chase of God and reaching for God. And just like the wise men following the star, we are following Jesus. I just think that's such a cool parallel. You know how Jesus says, "Follow me"? Well, the wise men were following the star to Jesus. And I just think it's a cool picture of what religion sort of looks like at its best. And on the flip side, on the other hand, religion is sort of not at its best when it's sort of focused in on itself. And the example of that is the Pharisees, of course. The Pharisees, they were an odd bunch. So there was a law full of, what you should and should not do. And they made a pile of laws on top of that just to make sure you never get even close to the actual, real sort of laws out there. And these guys were very inward focused. And I think this is one reason why the Gospels are so important to read, is because we get this sort of contrast between the Pharisees and Jesus. And the Pharisees weren't compatible with Jesus, and yet they were religious people. And so it's important that we never become, we never resemble these guys in any way. And it's sort of a cautionary tale. Let's not resemble the Pharisees. And so I think religion is sort of at its best when we're reaching for God. And to bring it back to work, you might be wondering, okay, well, what does this have to do with work? The interesting thing about this story is that we're not reading about the wise men at a church service. We're reading about the wise men as they're about their work, as they're about looking at the stars. And they're not at a church event where spiritual things are scheduled to happen. They're in the middle of their work, and God meets them in this really profound way. And I think that's interesting. So for me, as someone who's thinking about work, thinking about faith, this story is interesting. Another story that I think is very interesting is the story of Daniel. And for those who are unfamiliar with Daniel, who is he and what's the story? Well, Daniel lived in sort of a confusing time when his country was being taken over by Babylon, by the Babylonian Empire. And the king of this empire, Nebuchadnezzar, decided to take the smartest and brightest people from Israel and have them work in his government. And so Daniel was one of these smart and bright people. And so interesting. So Daniel 1 sort of sets up this whole story. And I just want to read starting in verse 17. And so Daniel's already been selected. He's already been noticed as, okay, you are a smart, intelligent person that I want to make use of. And so what happens in Babylon? So let's start reading in verse 17. Daniel 1, 17. God gave these 4 young men, so Daniel and a few other guys, we'll read about them in a second. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom, and God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meaning of visions and dreams. When the training period ordered by the king was complete, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. And whenever the king consulted them on any matter requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the other guys that he had employed under his service. And so, okay, it's easy to sort of just pass by that and just read it. But I mean, let's just think about it for a second. So here are these guys who are so impressive at what they do, at their job, that they become the main advisors for the king. It's like they're on the board of directors for the Babylonian Empire. And imagine how awkward of a situation that is for Daniel. He's a Jew, and now he is, employed by the king who sort of took over his whole way of life in Israel. But they're so good at what they do that the king notices them, and they're, in the way I think about it, it's like they're on the board of directors of this whole empire. And when I first read this story, or when I first really read this story, I just sort of sat back and thought, so God gave him a passion for literature. What kind of literature did they read in Babylon, I wonder? If you just sort of think about it, what was the situation like? And I wonder if Daniel, being a Jew, asked himself, should I be interested in this? What's my role in this very interesting situation where I'm working for the king? And we could ask all sorts of questions. The Bible doesn't say too much about it. We just read about, pretty much as much as we know about Daniel and his love for literature. But it's interesting that God gave him that passion. And it's interesting to see where that sort of led him in his career path. And so I think this leads us to ask the question, what counts as spiritual? What counts? There's another story. This is the last story I'm going to tell. It's not a biblical story. It's about a guy who, quite recent, I suppose. His name was Eric Liddell. I hope I'm saying his name right. And he ran in 1924 Olympics. There's a famous movie made about him called Chariots of Fire. You guys know that movie? Da 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 da. You know that. I love that song. So this guy was a Christian, and there's a really cool quote by him. So let's just put up that picture. Okay, so this is him running, and this is the quote. It's such a cool quote. He says, "I believe God made me for a purpose, but He also made me fast, and when I run, I feel His pleasure." And that's such a sweet quote. Like, I love it. And it's like this guy, he had a talent, and he's also a missionary, and he sort of struggled with, okay, what's my duty here? Do I run in the Olympics? Am I a missionary? What should I take priority to? But when he ran, he felt the presence of God. And when he ran, it was a spiritual thing for him. And it's just such an interesting idea, and it's such a profound thought. So when a few of us actually got Pastor Vern a Christmas gift this year, it was a few different pictures centered around running, the thing that he loves to do. And this is one of the pictures that we gave him, and we thought we'd give him a few options. So, you see it already, yeah. So this is another option for him if he wants to display this in his office. It might give him motivation, he'll never beat me again, but anyone want to guess whose idea this was? This wasn't mine, but anyways. So we look at these three different examples, such different people doing such different things, and yet they all sort of felt some sort of spiritual meaning to what they did. And so, again, it leads us to ask the question, what counts as spiritual? And so I've been thinking about this quite a lot this fall. I started doing web development, as I said before, and I think it's easy for us to say, okay, when we go to church, when we go to places that are designated for scheduled, spiritual things, or when we, set time aside to pray at home or whatever, those are spiritual things that we do. And then when we go about our work, or when we do sort of the necessary things about our day, we draw a line and we say, okay, those are unspiritual things. And when we look at these three examples, I want to say maybe the line's more blurry. Maybe there isn't a line. Maybe there's a sense in which some of the things that we love to do are in fact spiritual as well. And I feel like we do a great disservice to ourselves when we sort of chop up and organize our lives into spiritual and non-spiritual parts. I think that's leads to a disconnected life. And, it's a very easy thing to do because I like things to be organized and categorized and things to make sense. But I think when we read these stories, and there's many other stories in the Bible, I think we might be challenged by the idea that maybe our whole lives are supposed to be in some way spiritual. And I think for us, especially living in our culture, it's hard to think that way because we're taught that, okay, so there is a time and place for spiritual things and for your personal values. And then there's a time when you go into public work, that's the time to sort of put your values aside and leave it in the sort of the private space or whatever. There's a difference between public and private space. And we've sort of been taught good manners in that way. And I can see why people have divided it that way, and in some ways that's appropriate. But we need to figure out, okay, so when it comes to the thing that we care about the most, our faith, when it comes to our convictions, our passions, for us to disconnect ourselves from that when we start working is the worst. It leads to a hollow sort of work life, you know. And so how can we marry the two in an appropriate way? How can we allow our work to be something spiritual? And this is not an easy question, and I'm not going to pretend that it is. And the reason why is because there isn't any ready-made answers for us, because each one of us does something different. And it's going to look different for each one of us in our different contexts. And so we've looked at 3 examples. We've looked at, get that picture off. Go to the other one, it's much better. We look at some, there we go, good. We look at Eric, this guy right here, and he had a very interesting way of dedicating his talent to God. When we look at the wise men, these guys who were interested in observing the world, these guys who, you know, this is the practice of science, you know, the people who are interested in observing the world and understanding it and knowing the truth. And these guys were wrapped up in this spiritual journey in such an interesting way. People who, as far as we know, didn't know anything about the Jewish faith. And then we look at Daniel, this really interesting guy who God gives him a passion for literature. I wonder, like, are you passionate about literature? Maybe God gave that to you. It's a really interesting thing to think about. You might think, well, can't God give me something maybe more spiritual? But the point of this is that maybe God has a bigger plan for all of our different skills and abilities and passions. And we need to think about, okay, how the work that I do is important. You know, the work that you do takes up so much of your time, so much of your life. You dedicate your life to your work. How can we make this spiritual? How can we involve God in it? And how can we, involve our convictions in it? And so, like I said, it's not an easy question. It requires you to really dig deep and to think, how does this work for me? And what is God calling me to do? And so there's one quote. There's a man his name is Alfred Whitehead. He lived a while ago. I don't have the exact date. But he wrote an essay on education. And so this isn't an essay on work, but it's on education. But I think this may help us in this discussion. And so the way he starts this essay is called, I think the essay is called Aims of Education. And he's talking about, okay, what do we want to produce when we are teaching, young children and teaching people in university? What do we want to produce? What kind of person do we want to produce for our society? And so it's a little bit wordy, but let me just read the first the first few words of this. Culture is activity of thought and receptiveness to beauty and humane feeling. Scraps of information have nothing to do with it. A merely well-informed man is the most useless bore on God's earth. What we should aim at producing is men who possess both culture and expert knowledge in some special direction. Their expert knowledge will give them the ground to start from, and their culture will lead them as deep as philosophy and as high as art. And so what is this guy saying? And why am I referencing this quote here? So this guy was a Christian, and he wants to make a distinction between expert knowledge and culture. And expert knowledge would simply be, an accountant has a certain set of skills that I will never have, and a mechanic has a certain set of skills to do their job that I'll never have. Despite what people think because I'm my dad's son, I know a lot about cars. I know nothing. I know nothing about cars. So it's kind of odd that way. But the expert knowledge and the skills that we bring to the table, that's one thing. But what he wants to point out is that if that's all you bring to your work, I'll just let him say it. You're the most useless bore on God's earth, quite blunt. But what he wants to say is there's another part, there's another component that matters, and he's using a broader term, culture. But what I want to say is your faith and your convictions and your passions and your curiosity. Although these things are not specific to one job, there's something that you can bring to any job, really. And it matters. And so it's not just about your skills, it's about you. What do you bring to the table? What is unique about you that you can contribute to your job? When the Babylonian Empire took over Israel, this is the situation Daniel was in, and the Jews were asking themselves, how do we navigate the situation now that we're in Babylon? And what does God say? He says, work to prosper the Babylonian Empire. And so maybe that's a way for us to think about our workplace as well. Let's try to do our best, our very best in our work. And let's let our convictions sort of motivate us to do our best. And let our convictions motivate us to deal with people a certain way. Most of our workplaces involve other people. And so how do you treat your coworkers? How do you treat the people you work with? And how might your faith sort of form the way that you treat people? And so there's all sorts of ways we could talk about this. How can our faith and our work come together? And so I just kind of want to leave that with you. And I want to ask you to think about it. Think about what does it look like for me personally in my own situation, in my own life? How do I make my work and my faith be the same category, be the same thing? There's a verse in Colossians 3:23, a very simple verse. It says, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord." And I believe that this is what God wants all of us to do. I believe that God wants us to work with all of our heart at what we do. And I think that God wants to do something unique in each one of our contexts, in each one of our workplaces, whether that's your 9 to 5, whether that's in your free time, in any sort of work that you're a part of. I think God wants to do something. And maybe God's given you, you think about the passions that you have, maybe God's given them to you for a reason. And so I want to, ask you, take your passions seriously and take your curiosity seriously. Maybe God's given you a curiosity in a certain area for a reason. And so I just want to encourage you to take that seriously. And so these are a few things that I've been sort of thinking about, wrestling with as I have sort of started this path in web development. And so I just want to, ask you to join me in your own way into figuring out how do we accomplish this, and how do we be, how do we live life well? How do we represent Christ well in our context? And so I just want to thank you for this opportunity to speak. It's so great to just be standing here talking to you guys. It's great, and I'm just really thankful to be able to do that. And so I wish you guys all the best in 2016.